Coffee scalded her skin as the arrogant billionaire laughed at her weight. He thought she was just a chubby nobody serving eggs in a rundown Brooklyn diner. He didn't know the terrifying boss of the Moretti family was watching from a dark corner, and he had just sealed his own fate. Monday mornings at Rosa's Diner on 3rd Avenue in Bay Ridge were usually a symphony of clinking silverware and low murmurs. Avery Russo loved the morning shift. At 24, she was painfully aware that she didn't fit the mold of a trendy New York City girl. She was soft, heavy-set, and carried her weight in her hips and stomach, a fact that had made her a target for cruel remarks since high school. But in the diner, hidden behind a slightly faded pink apron, she felt safe. She knew her regulars. She poured a perfect cup of dark roast, and she always remembered who took sugar and who took sweetener. Rain lashed against the large glass windows, blurring the bustling Brooklyn street outside. Avery wiped down the laminate counter, tucking a stray lock of dark curly hair behind her ear. Bradley Hayes pushed through the heavy glass door, bringing a gust of cold, damp air with him. Bradley was the youngest vice president at Kensington, and Tierney, a cutthroat wealth management firm in Manhattan. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than Avery's annual rent, and his slicked-back hair smelled of expensive oud and entitlement. He had only come to Bay Ridge because his foreign sports car had caught a flat tire on the Belt Parkway, forcing him to seek refuge while a private tow service was dispatched. Avery approached his booth with her usual warm, nervous smile, holding a steaming carafe of house blend coffee. "Good morning, sir. Can I get you started with a cup of coffee?" she asked, her voice gentle. Bradley didn't even look up from his ringing smartphone. He was frantically scrolling through messages, a deep scowl etched into his sharp features. "Just pour it, sweetheart, and don't drown it in cheap milk." Avery nodded carefully, lifting the heavy glass pot. She had dealt with rude customers before. It was a hazard of the service industry. But as she leaned in to fill his porcelain mug, Bradley suddenly aggressively shoved his arm out, completely oblivious to his surroundings, as he shouted into his phone. "I told you to dump the offshore accounts!" He barked into the receiver. His elbow slammed violently into Avery's wrist. The heavy carafe slipped from her grip. Scalding fresh off the burner coffee splashed directly onto Avery's forearm and completely soaked the front of her white cotton blouse. A sharp cry of pain escaped her lips. She stumbled backward, clutching her burning arm, her eyes watering instantly as the searing heat dug into her skin. Instead of apologizing, Bradley slammed his phone onto the table and stood up, looking at the tiny splatter of coffee that had narrowly missed his Italian leather shoes. He sneered, looking Avery up and down with absolute disgust. "Are you completely blind or just entirely uncoordinated?" Bradley snapped his voice, carrying across the suddenly quiet diner. "Look what you almost did to a $4,000 suit." I'm so sorry," Avery stammered, tears springing to her eyes. Her arm was throbbing, a bright, angry red welt already forming on her pale skin. "You hit my arm. Oh, save it!" Bradley interrupted, stepping closer and lowering his voice to a cruel, mocking pitch. "Maybe if you lost 100 pounds, you wouldn't be bumping into everything. Try laying off the pancakes, sweetheart. You're taking up the entire damn aisle." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over Rosa's Diner. Avery's cheeks burned hotter than the coffee on her skin. She wrapped her arms around her thick waist, suddenly feeling massive, exposed, and entirely worthless. The familiar sting of body-shaming paralyzed her. She just wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Bradley tossed a crumpled $5 bill onto the table. "Buy yourself a diet soda," he spat, grabbing his briefcase and storming out into the rain. Avery stood, frozen hot tears finally spilling over her thick eyelashes, cutting tracks through the dusting of flour on her cheeks. She hurried toward the swinging kitchen doors, desperate to hide her humiliation. She never noticed the man sitting in the shadowy corner booth. Cameron Moretti didn't say a word. He didn't have to. At 32, Cameron was the undisputed head of the Moretti Crime Syndicate, an organization that controlled the ports, the underground casinos, and a vast network of politicians from Albany to Manhattan. He was a man carved from marble and violence, with eyes the color of a bruised sky, and a reputation that made hardened criminals cross the street. He wore a simple black cashmere sweater, his massive tattooed forearms resting casually on the table. But the air around him had turned to ice. Cameron came to Rosa's diner every single morning at exactly 7 a.m. He never ordered food. He only ordered black coffee, and he only let Avery serve him. To the underworld, Cameron was a monster. But to Avery he was just Dom, the quiet, handsome regular who tipped $100 a week and always asked about her sick mother. She didn't know that 3 months ago, when a rival gang had ambushed Cameron in a nearby alley, it was Avery who had found him bleeding out near the diner's dumpsters. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't called the cops. She had simply dragged his heavy bleeding frame into the diner's pantry, locked the door, and spent 3 hours stitching a bullet wound in his shoulder, with trembling hands, weeping quietly, because she couldn't bear the thought of a stranger dying alone in the cold. She had saved his life. And from that night on, Cameron Moretti's black, empty heart belonged entirely to the soft, chubby waitress who thought she was invisible to the world. To Cameron, Avery's lush, heavy curves were a sanctuary. Her kindness was the only pure thing in his violently corrupt world. She was his secret obsession, his greatest weakness, and he protected her from the shadows with the ruthless efficiency of an apex predator. Slowly, Cameron stood up from his booth. He didn't look angry. In his world, anger was loud and sloppy. Cameron looked dead. He pulled out his encrypted phone and dialed a single number. "Leo!" Cameron said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "There's a man in a charcoal suit walking toward an Aston Martin on 86th Street. Get his plates. Get his name. Get his address." "Done, boss," his underboss replied instantly. Cameron hung up the phone. He walked past the spilled coffee, pushed open the swinging kitchen doors, and stepped into the back room to find his crying angel. Avery was leaning over the stainless steel prep sink, running freezing cold water over her blistering forearm. Her chest heaved with heavy, ragged sobs. It wasn't just the physical pain, it was the utter humiliation. Bradley's words echoed in her mind, tearing down the fragile walls of self-confidence she had spent years trying to build, taking up the entire damn aisle. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing she could carve away her own flesh. "Move your arm," a deep, rough voice ordered softly. Avery jumped, gasping, as she spun around. Cameron stood in the narrow kitchen aisle. He seemed to take up all the space in the room, his broad shoulders practically brushing the metal shelving racks. "Dom, you can't be back here." She sniffled hurriedly, trying to wipe her wet cheeks with her dry hand. "Customers aren't allowed in the kitchen." Cameron ignored her. He stepped into her personal space, his imposing presence instantly making her feel small, something she had rarely experienced in her life. He reached out his massive, calloused hands, gently wrapping around her uninjured wrist. His touch was incredibly tender, a jarring contrast to his dangerous appearance. He pulled her arm back under the cold water. "Keep it there. The burn needs to cool," he instructed, his eyes tracing the red, angry skin on her forearm. His jaw clenched so tight the muscle ticked under his olive skin. "Does it hurt?" "It's okay," she lied, her voice shaking. "I'm clumsy. I should have been watching where I was standing." "Do not lie to me, Piccola," Cameron murmured. using the Italian pet name that always made Avery's stomach flutter. Little one. And do not take the blame for the sins of an arrogant pig. He reached into his tailored slacks and pulled out a clean, monogrammed silk handkerchief. He carefully patted her arm dry, his thumbs brushing lightly over her soft, dimpled skin. Avery held her breath. She was always intensely aware of her body terrified,